The air on October 12, 1876, held the particular sort of chill that spoke not of autumn's gentle decline, but of winter's imminent, brutal siege. It was a cold that crept into the marrow, a harbinger felt most keenly by those who lived at the mercy of the seasons. In the small, isolated settlement of Providence Creek, nestled in a high mountain valley, that meant everyone. For Alara Vance, however, the cold was more than a discomfort. It was a mortal threat. She was 21 years old, a widow for 6 months, and the sole occupant of a hastily constructed cabin that was little more than a drafty box of green lumber. Her husband, Arthur, had been a man of books and blueprints in a world of axes and tradition. He had seen the future in principles of thermodynamics and structural engineering, while his neighbors saw it only in the thickness of a log wall and the height of a woodpile. They had called him a dreamer, a man whose hands were too soft for the realities of the frontier. His death that spring, a sudden fever that no poultice could break, had been seen by many as a sad but inevitable conclusion for a man so ill-suited to the rugged landscape. They had offered Alara their condolences, which felt more like judgments on her husband's legacy, and then they had left her to fend for herself. The cabin Arthur had managed to erect before his passing was a temporary shelter, a place to live while he planned their true home. He had spoken of it with a quiet fire in his eyes, a home built not on brute force, but on intelligence, a structure that would work with nature instead of fighting it. He had left behind a leather-bound journal filled with his precise, elegant script, detailing calculations, diagrams, and principles that were as foreign to the other settlers as the language of the ancients. Now, with the first snows dusting the peaks and her woodpile looking pitifully small, that journal was all she had left of him, and her only hope for survival. The men of Providence Creek gathered, as they often did, around the pot-bellied stove in Silas Croft's general store. The air was thick with the smells of pipe smoke, coffee, and drying wool. It was the de facto town hall, the place where public opinion was forged and community decisions were made, always under the stern, watchful eye of Gideon Blackwood, the settlement's oldest and most respected elder. It was into this bastion of patriarchal certainty that Alara Vance walked, her husband's journal clutched in her hands. She waited patiently for a lull in the conversation, her presence a quiet disruption. "Mr. Croft," she began, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the fear that gnawed at her. "I require a significant quantity of rough-sawn lumber, 4-inch planks, if you have them, and nails, a great many nails." Silas Croft, a man whose generosity was always measured against a customer's perceived good sense, leaned on his counter. "Building an addition, are you, Mrs. Vance? A bit late in the season for that." "No, sir," Alara replied. "I intend to clad my existing cabin. I am building a second wall around the first." A thick silence fell over the store. The men turned to look at her. Jedediah Stone, a lumberman whose arms were as thick as young saplings, let out a short, derisive laugh. "A second wall? What foolishness is this? If your cabin is cold, you need a bigger fire, not another set of walls to heat." Gideon Blackwood removed the pipe from his mouth, his expression one of weary condescension. "The girl is overwrought with grief, Jedediah. Let her speak." He turned his gaze to Alara. "Explain yourself, child. What is the purpose of such a thing?" Alara opened the journal, its pages filled with Arthur's familiar hand. "My husband's design calls for a hollow cavity wall, a space 10 inches wide between the existing structure and a new exterior shell. This space is to be filled with an insulating material." "And what material would that be?" Croft asked, a smirk playing on his lips. "Goose down? Sheep's wool? You'd need a flock of 1,000 geese to fill a wall." "Sawdust," Alara said simply. The word hung in the air for a moment before the room erupted in laughter. It was not a kind laughter. It was sharp and dismissive, the sound of settled minds confronted with an idea so alien it could only be a joke. Jedediah Stone slapped his knee, his face red with mirth. "Sawdust! By God, the girl means to build a house of wood shavings. You'll be housing every mouse and termite in the valley, Mrs. Vance." Gideon Blackwood raised a hand, silencing the room. His tone was that of a patient father explaining a fundamental truth to a stubborn child. "Ilara, listen to me. We build with what is strong. We build with what has substance. A log, hewn from a great tree, holds the heat of a fire because of its mass. It is solid. It endures. Sawdust is waste. It is flimsy. It is what's left over. It has no substance. It cannot hold heat. It will draw damp and rot your cabin from the outside in. This is a fantasy, a dangerous one." Ilara stood her ground, her knuckles white where she gripped the journal. "You are mistaken, Mr. Blackwood. It is not the mass of the wood that holds the heat, but the air trapped within its fibers. The principle is one of thermal resistance. A log is a poor insulator. It conducts heat away. Sawdust, when packed densely, traps millions of tiny pockets of air. Still air is the greatest insulator known. The heat from my stove will stay inside my home, not bleed out through solid logs into the cold." Her explanation was met with blank stares and shaking heads. She spoke of thermodynamics and convection, of R values and thermal breaks, all terms from Arthur's journal that she had spent countless nights studying by candlelight. To the men of Providence Creek, it was meaningless jargon, the ramblings of a dead dreamer, echoed by his grieving, unhinged widow. "Enough of this foolish talk," Blackwood declared, his patience exhausted. "We will not stand by and watch you bring ruin upon yourself. You are a ward of this community now, Ilara. Your husband is gone. You will cease this project. We will organize a party to cut you a proper supply of firewood. Jedediah will inspect your cabin and chink the logs properly. That is how we care for our own." "I appreciate the offer," Ilara said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet laced with steel. "But I do not require your charity. I require your lumber. I have the money." She placed a small, heavy leather pouch on the counter. It landed with the solid clink of silver coins. $47. It is all I have." Silas Croft looked from the pouch to Blackwood, a silent question in his eyes. The elder sighed, a deep, theatrical sound of resignation. "Sell her the lumber, Silas. A fool must be allowed to learn from their own folly. But mark my words, young woman, when this sawdust palace of yours fails, when the winter winds cut through it like a knife and you are freezing in the dark, do not come crying to us. You have been warned." Ilara did not flinch. She simply nodded. "I will remember your warning, Mr. Blackwood." She counted out the cost of the lumber, the nails, and several rolls of tar paper. The final sum was $27.30. Her savings, the final vestiges of the life she and Arthur had planned, were now more than halved. She arranged for Jedediah Stone's boys to deliver the lumber for an extra fee, knowing she could not possibly haul it herself. They agreed, their faces alight with the prospect of being paid to witness the construction of the Widow's Folly. The work began on October 15th. The first task was the foundation for the new wall, a measure Arthur had insisted upon in his notes to combat the very rot Gideon Blackwood had predicted. Ilara spent 3 days with a pick and shovel, her body unaccustomed to such grueling labor, digging a narrow trench around the 20 by 24-foot perimeter of her cabin. The trench was precisely 18 inches deep and 12 inches wide, its lines kept straight by strings stretched between stakes. Her hands, accustomed to needlepoint and kneading dough, were soon blistered, then calloused. Each evening, she would collapse onto her cot, muscles screaming in protest, only to rise before dawn and begin again. Next, she filled the trench with field stones, hauled one by one from the creek bed in a rickety wheelbarrow. It was slow, agonizing work. She learned the geometry of stone, how to fit irregular shapes together to form a stable base. She mixed her own mortar from sand, lime, and water, following Arthur's recipe, her arms aching from turning the heavy mixture with a hoe. The men of the settlement would walk by, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups, pausing to watch her toil. They offered no help, only pitying glances and muttered comments among themselves. She ignored them, focusing on the task at hand, on the satisfying scrape of the trowel and the solid seating of each stone. With the stone foundation complete and rising 6 inches above the ground, she began the framing. This was work that required precision. Using a handsaw and a tri-square, she cut the rough-sawn planks into studs and plates. The rhythmic rasp of the saw became the soundtrack of her days. She laid the tar paper over the foundation as a vapor barrier, another of Arthur's specifications, before erecting the vertical studs, spacing them exactly 24 inches apart. She was building a skeleton, a framework that would eventually hold the insulation that was the subject of so much scorn. The most daunting task was acquiring the sawdust itself. The local lumber mill, owned by a taciturn man named Phineas Cole, sat a mile down the valley. The sawdust was piled in a veritable mountain behind the mill, a byproduct considered useless, occasionally burned, or simply left to rot. When Alara approached Phineas with her request, he squinted at her. "You want the dust?" he grunted. "All of it?" "As much as I can haul," she replied. "I will pay you for it." He waved a dismissive hand. "Take it. It's worthless to me. Saves me the trouble of burning it." He saw the burlap sack she carried and the wheelbarrow she pushed, and seemed to take a small measure of pity on her. "My boy can help you load it, for $10 an hour." Alara agreed, though the expense pained her. For 2 weeks, she made the 2-mile round trip 3 or 4 times a day. Each journey was an ordeal. The wheelbarrow, laden with heavy sacks of damp sawdust, threatened to tip on the uneven ground. Her back and legs burned with the effort. The fine dust worked its way into her hair, her clothes, the very pores of her skin. She smelled perpetually of pine and spruce. The community watched this spectacle with a mixture of amusement and alarm. They saw not a resourceful woman executing a brilliant plan, but a widow driven mad by grief, engaging in a bizarre, self-punishing ritual. Back at the cabin, she did not simply dump the sawdust into the wall cavity. Arthur's journal contained a crucial instruction. She mixed the sawdust with hydrated lime, which she had also purchased from Silas Croft, at a ratio of 1 part lime to 5 parts sawdust. The lime, he had written, would deter insects and rodents, and more importantly, it would absorb any residual moisture, preventing the growth of mold and fungus. It was a simple, elegant solution to the primary objections the men had raised. Yet it was a step they could not have imagined. She mixed it in a large wooden trough, the fine white lime powder coating the brown wood dust, turning the whole mixture a pale, uniform tan. Finally, she began the infill. She nailed the exterior planks to the frame, working her way up from the bottom. Every 2 feet of height, she would stop and meticulously pack the lime sawdust mixture into the 10-inch cavity. She used a long pole to tamp it down, ensuring it was dense and free of voids. It was painstaking, repetitive work. Plank, pack, tamp. Plank, pack, tamp. The outer wall slowly climbed, encasing her small home in a thick, unassuming shell of rough wood. By the time she nailed the final plank into place under the eaves in early December, the first serious snows had already begun to fall. Her cabin now looked strange, bloated. It lacked the rustic, iconic aesthetic of the traditional log homes. Its corners were perfectly square, its surfaces flat and plain. Jedediah Stone, passing by on his way to check his traps, called out, "It looks like the box it came in!" His laughter echoed in the cold, crisp air. Elara did not reply. She was too tired, and there was nothing to say. The proof would not be in words, but in warmth. The change inside was immediate and profound. Her small cast-iron stove, which had previously struggled to beat back the chill in the far corners of the single room, now seemed to radiate heat with an almost magical efficiency. Before, the log walls had always been cold to the touch, constantly leaching warmth from the interior air. Now, the inner walls of her cabin felt neutral, almost warm. The science Arthur had written about was manifesting as a palpable, physical reality. A deep, quiet sense of satisfaction settled over her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She was using less than a third of the firewood she had consumed the previous winter, yet she was warmer. On December 18th, 1876, Gideon Blackwood paid her a visit. He knocked on her door, his face a mask of solemn concern that Elara knew was feigned. He wanted to see the failure for himself. She invited him in. He stepped across the threshold and immediately stopped, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. The air inside was not just warm, it was a comfortable, even heat, free of the drafts that plagued every other structure in the valley. "It is surprisingly temperate in here," he admitted, his voice tight. "The design is performing as expected," Elara said, pouring him a cup of hot tea. Blackwood looked around the small space, his eyes searching for the flaw, the fatal error he was so certain existed. He ran a hand along the interior wall. "This will not last," he pronounced, his certainty returning. "This is a false comfort. When the real cold comes, when the wind blows for 3 days straight from the north, this box of dust will betray you. The cold will find its way in. The damp will turn your insulation to a block of ice. I came here today to make you an offer, out of Christian duty. When your home fails, you are to come to the meeting hall. We will have a fire going, and there will be shelter for you there." "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Blackwood," Elara replied, her tone perfectly even. "But I will be fine here. I have faith in my husband's knowledge and in the laws of thermodynamics." He shook his head, a sad, knowing smile on his face. "You have faith in foolishness, child. Pride is a dangerous sin. Remember my offer." He placed his cup down, untouched, and left, pulling his thick wool coat tight around him as he stepped back out into the cold. He was convinced he had just left a woman doomed by her own stubborn pride. The storm arrived on the winter solstice, December 21st. It did not come gently. The sky, which had been a clear, piercing blue that morning, turned to a bruised, slate-gray curtain by noon. The wind began to moan through the pines, a low, mournful sound that steadily rose in pitch and intensity until it became a piercing shriek. Then the snow began, not in flakes, but in a horizontal, blinding torrent. The settlers called it a white hurricane, a blizzard of such ferocity that it seemed bent on scouring the very memory of civilization from the mountainside. Inside the log cabin of Jedediah Stone, a structure he had built with his own hands from massive 20-inch diameter logs, the family huddled around a roaring fire. Yet, the cold was winning. The immense thermal mass of the logs, which Jedediah had always boasted about, had turned against him. Over the preceding weeks of deepening cold, the logs had become vast reservoirs of frigid energy. The fire could not heat them. Instead, the logs wicked the warmth out of the cabin's air, conducting it directly outside into the heart of the storm. The walls were literally sucking the life out of the room. Jedediah fed log after log into the fireplace, his precious wood supply vanishing at an alarming rate, fighting a losing battle against the unyielding laws of physics. At Gideon Blackwood's home, the oldest and supposedly best built in the valley, a different crisis was unfolding. The gale-force winds swirled around the eaves, creating a negative pressure zone in the chimney. The smoke from his hearth, unable to rise, poured back into the room, thick and acrid. His wife and grandchildren were coughing, their eyes streaming. The fire that was meant to save them was now trying to suffocate them. He was forced to smother it, plunging the main room into a frigid, smoky gloom, the temperature dropping with terrifying speed. In Alara Vance's cabin, there was a profound and surreal stillness. The thick, 10-inch layer of packed sawdust was not only a thermal barrier, but an acoustic one as well. The storm's banshee wail was reduced to a distant, muted hum. The single-pane windows rattled in their frames, the only reminder of the elemental chaos raging just inches away. The small stove glowed with a steady, cherry-red warmth, consuming a single, modest log every hour. The air was a consistent 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Alara sat at her small table, mending a sock by the light of a kerosene lamp, the sense of peace and security so complete it felt like a dream. Arthur's calculations, his theories, his faith in reason, it was all real. It was keeping her alive. The storm raged through the night and into the next day, its fury unabated. The temperature plummeted to 30 degrees below zero, with a wind chill that was simply unimaginable. Around midday on December 22nd, a tremendous crack, like a rifle shot, echoed through the valley, barely audible over the wind. It was a massive pine tree, its trunk encased in ice and battered by the wind, giving way. It fell directly onto the roof of Jedediah Stone's cabin. The main ridge beam, thick as a man's waist, fractured under the immense impact. Snow began to pour in through the splintered roof. The fire was extinguished by the cascade of powder. Panic set in. The cabin was no longer a shelter, it was a trap. Inside Alara's home, a faint, rhythmic thumping sound began at her door, nearly lost in the storm's drone. At first, she thought it was a branch or a loose shutter, but it persisted, desperate and insistent. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, she went to the door and unbolted it. The wind tore it from her grasp, slamming it open against the interior wall. Framed in the swirling vortex of white stood Jedediah Stone. He was a creature of snow and ice, his beard a frozen mass, his face a mask of desperation. Behind him, his wife clutched their two small, shivering children. "Mrs. Vance!" he shouted over the gale, his voice cracking with shame and cold. "My roof! It's gone! We're freezing! For the love of God, can you help us?" His eyes, which had once held such mockery, were now pleading. He was not looking at the widow's folly, he was looking at his only hope. Alara did not hesitate. There was no trace of triumph in her expression, only a quiet, resolute compassion. "Get inside, quickly," she said, helping his wife and children over the threshold and fighting to push the heavy door closed against the crushing force of the wind. The moment the bolt slid home, the roar of the storm was once again banished, replaced by the gentle crackle of the stove. The Stone family stood in the center of the room, dripping and shivering, their eyes wide with disbelief at the impossible warmth that enveloped them. An hour later, another frantic pounding came at the door. It was Silas Croft and his family. An ice dam had formed on their roof, and freezing water was now pouring into their living quarters, soaking their bedding and supplies. Their fire was out, the cabin uninhabitable. They too were welcomed into the warmth, their faces a mixture of relief and profound embarrassment. The small cabin was becoming crowded, but the air remained warm, the little stove performing its duties with unwavering efficiency. Just as dusk began to fall, a final, weaker series of knocks was heard. Alara opened the door to find Gideon Blackwood, his wife, and their grandchildren. The elder looked ancient, defeated. His home was filled with smoke, the temperature inside now below freezing. He did not meet Alara's eyes. He stared at the floor, his pride a shattered ruin. "Mrs. Vance?" he rasped, his voice hoarse from smoke and shame. "We were wrong." "You were right." Alara simply nodded and gestured for them to enter. "There is room by the stove, Mr. Blackwood." The night passed in a state of shared, silent awe. The three most powerful men in Providence Creek, the three who had led the chorus of ridicule against her, were now refugees in her home, their families saved by the very structure they had condemned. They watched as Alara added a single log to the stove every hour. They felt the unwavering, life-giving heat. They saw the children, who had been blue with cold, now sleeping peacefully, wrapped in Alara's spare blankets. There were no more jokes about termite palaces or boxes of dust. There was only the humbling, undeniable truth. Not one of them had understood the principles of the natural world, as well as the quiet young woman they had dismissed as a fool. Not one of them had built a shelter capable of withstanding nature's fury, and not one of them could deny that they owed their lives and the lives of their families to her. The blizzard broke on the morning of Christmas Eve. For 3 full days it had held the valley in its icy grip. When the sun finally emerged, it revealed a world transformed, buried under a staggering 8 feet of snow. The landscape was pristine, beautiful, and deadly. The settlement of Providence Creek was a collection of snow-draped mounds, with only the stovepipes hinting at the structures beneath. The inhabitants of Alara's Ark emerged into the blinding white, their small cabin having sheltered 14 souls in its steadfast warmth. The contrast between their survival and the devastation around them was stark. Jedediah's cabin was a ruin, its back broken. Gideon's was stained with soot and filled with the stench of stale smoke. Silas's store had a gaping hole in its roof where the ice dam had finally given way, his stock of goods likely ruined. Their wood piles, which they had believed to be monumental, were nearly gone, consumed in a desperate, futile battle against the cold. Alara's woodpile, by contrast, was still impressively large. She had used less than a quarter of her supply. The true cost of the storm, and of their collective dogma, became clear later that day. A search party, led by a humbled Jedediah Stone, made its way to the farthest cabin in the settlement, home to the Miller family, who had a newborn child. They had not been able to make it to Alara's cabin. The search party found the cabin silent and cold, the fire long dead. The family had succumbed to the cold during the second night, their thick log walls having offered no more protection than a tent in the end. A somber pall fell over the survivors. The vindication was complete, but it was not a moment for celebration. It was a moment for grim reflection. Pride had not just been foolish, it had been fatal. In the days that followed, the social structure of Providence Creek was irrevocably altered. Gideon Blackwood's authority, built on a lifetime of tradition and certainty, had crumbled. He was no longer the unassailable elder, but an old man who had been spectacularly, dangerously wrong. The community, facing the daunting task of rebuilding and surviving the rest of the winter, no longer looked to him for guidance. They looked to Alara. They came to her cabin not with mockery, but with reverence. They brought offerings of preserved food and solemn apologies. Jedediah Stone, his booming voice now quiet and respectful, asked if she would show him the pages in her husband's journal that detailed the construction of the walls. Silas Croft, facing financial ruin, asked if she knew of a way to rebuild his store that would not require a fortune in firewood to heat. Gideon Blackwood came last, alone. He stood before her, his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice heavy with the weight of his error. "Your husband was a man of vision, a genius. We were too blind and too proud to see it. And you? You have his strength, his courage, and his wisdom. You honored his legacy, and you saved us from our own ignorance. I am in your debt." Alara accepted his apology with the same quiet grace with which she had endured his scorn. There was no need for recrimination. The storm had been a harsh enough teacher. "My husband believed that understanding the world was the key to living in it," she said softly. "He believed that knowledge was a shelter stronger than any log." That spring, the sound of saws and hammers once again filled the valley. But the settlers were not felling the great ancient trees for their massive trunks. They were taking them to Phineas Cole's mill to be sawn into planks and studs. They were digging foundations and building frames. They hauled countless loads of sawdust, now mixed with lime, from the great pile behind the mill, a pile they no longer saw as waste, but as a precious resource. They were all building sawdust walls. Alara Vance, the young widow they had once pitied and ridiculed, became their teacher. She moved through the rebuilding settlement, her husband's journal in hand, consulting on measurements, explaining the principles of the vapor barrier, and showing them how to properly pack the insulation. She was no longer an outcast. She was the sage of Providence Creek, the keeper of essential knowledge. Her small, boxy cabin, the former object of scorn, was now the model for their future, a testament to the fact that true strength is found not in brute mass or blind tradition, but in the quiet, methodical application of a well-reasoned, unconventional idea. The warmth that had saved them all had come not from a bigger fire, but from a better wall.